WorldDenver talks today with Dr. Elizabeth Economy, the CV Senior Fellow and Director of Asian Studies for the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to Denver.
Thanks very much, Joe.
China and the United States have a very important relationship, probably one of the most significant ones in the world, but both sides are skeptical of one another. How do you see things working out in that equation?
I think there are a number of challenges that we face in trying to make progress in developing a stronger foundation with the Chinese. First, frankly, is just the sheer proliferation of issues that we have between us. You know, for several decades, it was really simply trade, Taiwan, and human rights. And those three issues defined the U.S. China bilateral relationship. Today, there's really not an issue that doesn't engage both our countries, from cyber hacking to global climate change to North Korea and Iran, issues of proliferation. It's really the full range of global challenges that need both China and the United States to participate and sometimes to cooperate. So I think there's a lot that we have on our plate. I think fundamentally, the way that the Chinese approach issues tends to be different from the way that Americans tend to approach them. That is to say that the Chinese like to operate at a meta level, right? They deal in broad principles and commitments. For example, right now in the U.S. China relationship, they want to develop a new relationship among major powers. But for Americans, what does that really mean? You know, we tend to deal in much more concrete objectives with outcomes. You know, we want China's cooperation on sanctioning North Korea. We want China to have definitive goals for limiting carbon dioxide emissions for climate change. So I think we approach things in different ways. We commit to things in different ways. I also think from the Chinese perspective that they believe, and in some cases probably rightly, that the United States fundamentally wants to see regime change in China, that we want political evolution, and are not satisfied with dealing with China as an authoritarian state. And of course, this produces a certain level of distrust. By the same token, I think here in the United States, we look at Chinese behavior on issues like intellectual property rights protection, or certainly on this issue, this emerging challenge of cyber hacking, and think that the Chinese really are fundamentally undermining U.S. strategic and economic interests. And so how do you begin to build trust when you have those kinds of fundamental different approaches and fundamentally different objectives?
We recognize that, particularly during the presidential election, a lot of things are being said during the campaign for domestic consumption. There are things apparently being said within China for domestic consumption. How honest do you think the behind-the-scenes discussions are?
I think that there is recognition, frankly, in both countries by this time, both within the political elite and certainly within the sort of foreign policy community, that what is said in the throes of a political transition in China or in an election year in the United States, that these things are likely to have very little bearing on actual policy. I think both the United States and China, that we've become far more sophisticated in our understanding of the need for leaders to speak to a domestic audience and at the same time, you know, speak to an international audience, that the messages might be somewhat different. But again, I think for the United States, we tend to look at deliverables. And no matter what the Chinese are saying about what they're doing, we want to see, you know, concrete action, concrete improvement on the list that we often seem to present to them of things that we want them to do. You know, the Chinese rarely have a list of things that they want us to do. Mostly they want us to leave them alone. So I think we have a much better understanding of the sort of general approaches that we take to having both a domestic and a foreign policy dialogue. The real question is whether we can find a way to bridge the gap between those.
The 18th Party Congress this past fall selected a new leadership that's feeling its way. How do you assess the new leadership?
Well, certainly it's early days. We've just completed the political transition in China, this past March. They have 7 people in the Standing Committee of the Politburo, sort of the 7 group that will govern by consensus. I think overall, the Chinese leadership is a reasonably conservative group. It's not one that has demonstrated sort of in all of their past careers and political trajectories, not a group as a whole that has demonstrated a real talent or initiative for reform. They've not been particularly bold reformers, with the exception of Wang Qishan, who is now in charge of their anti-corruption effort in the Chinese government. So I think, I would say that they are competent, but not necessarily a sort of stellar innovative group of leaders. I think reasonably conservative. I think there's going to be a tendency as well, at least again in early days, for the leadership to fall back on nationalism as one of the sort of essential pillars of their legitimacy. I think they're trying to develop new values and an ideology that is compelling to the Chinese people, because they don't have that right now. I mean, really, what is the basis of legitimacy for the Chinese leadership? And I think as their economy is slowing a little bit, we've seen, that they've had a, drop in their GDP year on year in the growth rate. They've had dropping exports. They've had a number of economic challenges. I think, again, they're going to be looking for something on which to rest their legitimacy.
Analysts say that it's a new government largely of technocrats, where in the past there was the deep revolutionary basis, the Long March veterans and everything, that there's now a distance between those founding fathers of the People's Republic. What are the implications there?
I think that's true. I mean, I think there are probably a couple of implications. Number one, of course, is their own life experiences, right? And what they have lived through or not lived through in order to achieve their success. Right, and for the revolutionary leaders, living in extreme poverty and really being part of the founding of their country and the founding of the principles of this ostensibly communist country, socialist country, I think very deeply rooted in their personal convictions and their roles. For this new leadership, as you mentioned, not having experienced that, I don't think they have that same sense of having fought quite as much for where they are now. They've gotten, in large part, they've gotten where they've gotten because they've kept their heads low, right? As I mentioned, they have not been a terribly reform-oriented group. They haven't been terribly bold in what they've attempted when they've sort of governed their provinces. So I think they've played it safe. So I think that's different. But I think that probably the key difference from a leadership perspective is that they don't have that legitimacy. That this is a leadership that neither has served, in the revolution, nor has been touched by someone who served in the revolution. I mean, Xi Jinping is the first General Secretary of the Communist Party and President of the country who was not handpicked by Deng Xiaoping. So his legitimacy comes as sort of at a distance. It's removed from this revolutionary leadership.
Well, a lot of China watchers in the United States are looking to see how the new leadership responds to the issues in North Korea.
I think North Korea is really quite interesting these days. I mean, in many respects, it's been one of China's few allies or client states, and certainly the most important as a buffer against what China often perceives as a kind of encirclement of U.S. allies in its own backyard. But I think, given North Korea's behavior recently, increasingly viewed as, erratic and sort of bombastic rhetoric and the missile testing, the Chinese are getting fed up. And you can see in the Chinese press and in sort of Chinese policy circles a lot of discussion about whether it's time to rethink their policy toward North Korea. Talking about North Korea as a sort of millstone around China's neck, dragging it down. And after all, what does China actually get from North Korea? That it's really much more bother than it's worth. And I think we're in the midst of a potentially fundamental rethink, within China's elite. At this point, it's still a debate. And a pretty, I think, vociferous debate, which is even playing out in the Chinese media. So you can read it and see it, which doesn't happen that often in China. They haven't decided what they're going to do. But I think over time, unless North Korea takes a step back, I think the Chinese are increasingly going to take a tougher line toward North Korea. Because at this point, it's really looking like, all pain and no gain, really, in terms of the relationship.